HOA Karen cut down my fruit trees, so I reported her for wildlife destruction. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Maple Street as I turned into my driveway, exhausted from another grueling day at the accounting firm. The quarterly reports had been particularly brutal, and all I wanted was to sit in my backyard with a cold beer and watch the evening light filter through the leaves of my beloved apple and pear trees. But as I stepped out of my car, something was wrong. Terribly wrong. The air smelled of fresh sawdust and gasoline from chainsaws. My heart began to race as I walked toward my backyard, following a trail of wood chips that shouldn't have been there. The sight that greeted me will haunt me forever. Where my magnificent apple and pear trees once stood, trees that had graced my property for 15 years, trees that had been my sanctuary, my connection to my late mother, only jagged stumps remained. Sawdust clung to the morning dew on my lawn like snow after a massacre. Branches and leaves were scattered across the yard as if a tornado had torn through my personal paradise. Standing amid the carnage, brushing wood chips off her pristine navy blazer, was Patricia Hawthorne, president of the Hawthorne Heights Homeowners Association. She held a pair of pruning shears in one hand like some twisted trophy, and wore that same smug, self-satisfied smile she always had when enforcing her increasingly ridiculous rules. "Oh, hello there, David," she said with mock sweetness, her voice dripping with false concern. "I finally got around to that beautification order. These trees were really bringing down property values, you know. The neighborhood will thank me for this." I felt my stomach drop to my feet, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. Those weren't just trees. They were living memories, growing monuments to love and loss. My mother and I had planted those saplings together 15 years ago, just months before she passed away from cancer. It was one of our last projects together, something she insisted on doing despite her weakening condition. "Mom," I had said that spring day, "you should rest." The doctor said a lot of things," she had interrupted with that determined smile I inherited. "But he didn't say I couldn't plant trees with my son. These will grow long after I'm gone, David. Every spring when they bloom, every fall when you harvest the fruit, I'll be right here with you." She was right. Every spring when the apple blossoms burst into clouds of pink and white, every fall when I climbed the ladder to pick bushels of crisp fruit, I felt her presence. The trees had become my church, my therapy, my connection to the woman who taught me everything about resilience and love. The Hawthorne Heights HOA had been sending vague notices about non-conforming vegetation for the past year, ever since Patricia took over as president after the previous board stepped down. But there was never any formal documentation, never any specific violations cited, just passive-aggressive notes tucked under my door about maintaining neighborhood aesthetic standards and ensuring property values remain competitive. I had always assumed these notices were about my lawn ornaments, the ceramic gnomes my mother had collected, or maybe the colorful wind chimes that sang in the evening breeze. Perhaps they objected to the color of my mailbox or the wildflower garden I'd planted along the fence. Never in my wildest dreams did I think Patricia would actually destroy my trees. "You had no right," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the rage building inside me like a pressure cooker about to explode. "Those trees were on my property. You needed my permission. You needed proper documentation, proper procedures." Patricia waved her hand dismissively, as if swatting away an annoying fly. "Actually, according to Section 12.4 of our bylaws, any vegetation extending over 6 feet from the property line falls under common area maintenance jurisdiction." She pulled out her phone and showed me a grainy, obviously manipulated photo. "See that branch? It was clearly 7 feet over the line. I measured it myself with professional equipment." I looked at the stumps again, my mind reeling. Both trees had been completely on my property, at least 10 feet from any boundary line. I had been meticulous about placement when we planted them, specifically to avoid any potential disputes. "That's a lie, and you know it," I said, my voice growing stronger with conviction. "Those trees were nowhere near the property line." She shrugged with an expression of complete indifference, as if we were discussing the weather rather than the destruction of my most precious possessions. "Take it up with the board if you want. Meetings next month." Though between you and me, they were all in agreement that something needed to be done about your little orchard situation. The way she said orchard made it sound like I was running some kind of illegal farming operation instead of having 2 fruit trees in my backyard. Her tone was condescending, dismissive, designed to make me feel small and insignificant. As she walked away, swinging her pruning shears like a baton, I noticed something that made my heart sink even further. A family of robins that had nested in the apple tree every year for the past decade was circling overhead, chirping frantically. They kept diving down toward where their home used to be, confused and distressed. Their nest, with 3 blue eggs I had been watching develop, was now scattered among the debris. Gray squirrels ran back and forth across my fence, searching for the branches they had used as highways between yards. A cardinal that had claimed the pear tree as his territory perched on my roof, calling out in what sounded like mourning. The entire ecosystem of my backyard had been destroyed in a single morning. The investigation begins that evening. I sat among the wreckage of my trees, trying to process what had happened. The silence was deafening, no rustling leaves, no bird songs, no gentle creaking of branches in the wind. Just the stark reality of 2 jagged stumps and a yard full of sawdust. I called my neighbor Eleanor, an elderly widow who had been like a second mother to me since my own mother passed. Eleanor had been an environmental lawyer before retiring, and she had an encyclopedic knowledge of local wildlife and conservation laws. "Eleanor, I need your help," I said, my voice still shaking with emotion. "Patricia destroyed my trees today. Just cut them down without permission, without notice, without anything." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "David, honey, are you sure? I mean, I know Patricia can be difficult, but destroying someone's trees? That's serious business." I walked her through everything that had happened, from coming home to find the destruction to Patricia's smug justification. As I spoke, I could hear Eleanor's breathing become more rapid, more agitated. "David," she said finally, "you need to document everything. Take photos, measure distances, write down exactly what Patricia said to you. And call that neighbor across the street, the one with the security camera. If there's footage of this, you'll need it." "Why? What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking Patricia may have bitten off more than she can chew." "Our neighborhood." "David, I don't know if you remember, but years ago I mentioned that our subdivision was built along a critical wildlife corridor. There are protections in place for mature trees, especially fruit-bearing ones that provide food for migrating birds." My heart began to race for a different reason now. "What kind of protections?" "State-level protections. The California Department of Fish and Wildlife has specific regulations about tree removal in designated wildlife corridors. Any removal requires permits, environmental impact assessments, the works. If Patricia didn't follow proper procedures, and it sounds like she didn't, she may have committed a serious crime." Over the next few days, I threw myself into documentation like a man possessed. I took photographs of the stumps from every angle, measuring the distances from property lines with a professional surveyor's tape. I found that both trees had been at least 12 feet from the nearest boundary, nowhere near the 6-foot limit Patricia had claimed. I knocked on doors throughout the neighborhood, asking if anyone had witnessed the destruction. My neighbor across the street, Mr. Johnson, was particularly helpful. His security camera system had captured the entire incident. "I was wondering what all that noise was about," he said, pulling up the footage on his laptop. "Started around 6 in the morning. I just figured it was city work or something." The video was damning. It showed Patricia directing a 3-man tree service crew, pointing at my trees and gesturing emphatically. She was clearly in charge, clearly the one giving orders. The timestamp showed 6:15 a.m., a time when she knew I would be at work. But the most important discovery came when I started researching the wildlife protections Eleanor had mentioned. According to state conservation records, our entire subdivision was indeed built along a critical migratory path for several bird species. The California Department of Fish and Wildlife had specific protections in place for mature trees in our area, especially fruit-bearing ones that provided food for migrating birds. I spent hours in the county records office, pulling up documents that painted a clear picture. Our neighborhood had been designated as part of a wildlife corridor in 1987, long before most of the houses were built. The protections were designed to maintain habitat for migrating birds, particularly during nesting season. The robins I had seen weren't just any birds, they were part of a protected species that relied on established nesting sites. I found documentation showing that my trees had been registered as part of a citizen science project tracking urban wildlife habitats. I had submitted data about bird species and nesting activity for the past 5 years as part of a Cornell University research project. Even more damning, I discovered that 5 years ago, the previous HOA board had received a commendation from the Audubon Society for maintaining bird-friendly landscapes in urban environments. The award specifically mentioned the mature fruit trees throughout the neighborhood and their importance to local wildlife. Patricia hadn't just destroyed my trees, she had violated state wildlife protection laws. The legal machinery on Monday morning, I walked into the regional office of the California Department of Fish and Wildlife with a thick folder of evidence. The receptionist, a young woman with kind eyes, looked up as I approached. "I need to file a complaint about the illegal destruction of protected habitat," I said. She directed me to Wildlife Officer Sarah Chen, a no-nonsense woman in her 40s who had been investigating environmental crimes for over a decade. I spread my evidence across her desk, photographs of the destroyed trees, the security footage, Patricia's written admission that she had ordered the removal, and documentation about the protected species that had lived there. Officer Chen examined each piece of evidence carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I showed her the photos of the robin's nest scattered among the debris, her expression hardened. "Mr. Martinez," she said, "what you're describing is a clear violation of state wildlife protection laws. The person who ordered this removal could face serious criminal charges, not just fines." Criminal charges? Destruction of protected habitat is a misdemeanor that can carry up to 6 months in jail and fines up to $50,000 per violation. If we can prove that multiple protected species were displaced, each species counts as a separate violation. I felt a mixture of vindication and anxiety. I had wanted justice, but I hadn't expected it to be this serious. What happens now? We open a formal investigation. I'll need to visit the site, take measurements, collect soil samples, and interview witnesses. Then we'll need to speak with the person who ordered the removal. Within 3 days, the investigation was in full swing. Officer Chen arrived at my house with a partner, Wildlife Officer Marcus Rodriguez, and a team of environmental specialists. They spent hours documenting the destruction, taking measurements, and collecting samples. They were particularly interested in the ecological impact. The specialists found evidence of at least 4 different bird species that had regularly used the trees: American robins, house finches, cedar waxwings, and northern mockingbirds. They also documented 2 mammal species, gray squirrels and raccoons, that had relied on the trees for shelter and food. "This is significant habitat destruction," Officer Chin told me as they packed up their equipment. These trees were clearly established nesting sites and food sources for multiple protected species. The next step was interviewing Patricia. I watched from my window as Officer Chen and Officer Rodriguez knocked on her door. Patricia came out with her usual confident demeanor, but I could see it falter the moment they showed their badges. The conversation started on her front porch, with Patricia gesturing dismissively and speaking in an animated fashion. But as the officers continued talking, her body language changed. Her shoulders sagged, her gestures became less confident, and finally, she invited them inside. Even from across the street, I could hear her voice getting higher and more defensive as the interview progressed. At one point, she came outside and pointed toward my property, clearly trying to justify her actions. But the officers took notes methodically, their expressions remaining neutral and professional. The investigators spent the rest of the day interviewing other neighbors. Eleanor was particularly helpful, providing years of birdwatching logs that documented the species visiting our street. She had been keeping detailed records as part of her own amateur naturalist hobby, and her documentation proved invaluable. "I've been watching birds in this neighborhood for 20 years, she told the officers. David's trees were a critical part of the local ecosystem. Every spring, at least 3 different species of birds nested there. The fruit provided food for wildlife well into the fall. By the end of the week, the investigation had uncovered something that changed everything. When the officers examined the work order for the tree removal, they found Patricia's name on the contract, not as HOA president, but as a private citizen. She had paid for the removal herself and then tried to retroactively justify it as HOA business. The tree service company readily provided their copy of the contract, signed by Patricia personally. When questioned, the company foreman said Patricia had specifically told them she had all necessary permits and permissions for the removal. She seemed very confident about her authority, he told the investigators. Said she was the HOA president and that this was routine neighborhood maintenance. We assumed she had done her homework. This revelation turned the case from a simple administrative violation into potential criminal fraud. Patricia had acted outside her actual authority, used her position to deceive the tree service company, and then attempted to cover up her actions by claiming HOA authorization after the fact. The reckoning, the formal charges came down like a hammer. The Department of Fish and Wildlife issued citations for unauthorized destruction of protected habitat, with fines starting at $10,000 for the initial violation. But that was just the beginning. Each protected species that had been displaced added another $5,000 to the total. With 4 bird species and 2 mammal species documented, the fines quickly mounted to $40,000. Additionally, Patricia faced criminal charges for destruction of protected habitat and fraud for misrepresenting her authority. Patricia tried to fight the charges at first. She hired an expensive environmental lawyer and attempted to shift blame onto the tree service company, claiming they should have known about the wildlife protections. But the company had emails from Patricia specifically stating that she had obtained all necessary permissions and permits. Her lawyer dropped the case after reviewing the evidence. "There's no defense here," he reportedly told her. "The evidence is overwhelming, and the fraud charges make this a criminal matter." News of the investigation spread quickly through the neighborhood. The local newspaper picked up the story, running a front-page article titled "HOA President Faces Criminal Charges for Destroying Protected Wildlife Habitat." The story included photos of my destroyed trees and quotes from environmental experts about the importance of urban wildlife corridors. The HOA board called an emergency meeting, and this time, the community center was packed. Word had spread about Patricia's legal troubles, and residents were angry. Not just about my trees, but about years of Patricia's increasingly authoritarian behavior. One by one, neighbors stood up to share their stories of Patricia's petty tyranny. Mrs. Goldman, an elderly widow, told about how Patricia had fined her $500 for flying an American flag that was supposedly the wrong size. The Morales family described how Patricia had forced them to remove a wheelchair ramp for their disabled son because it wasn't the approved beige color specified in the HOA guidelines. Tom Bradley, a software engineer who lived on Oak Street, recounted how Patricia had tried to ban children from playing in their own front yards after 4 p.m. because their laughter was disruptive to the evening ambience. "She's turned our neighborhood into a police state," said Jennifer Walsh, a mother of 2. "My kids are afraid to ride their bikes because they might get in trouble for some made-up rule." The stories went on for hours. Patricia sat at the head of the table, her face growing redder with each testimony. When it came time to vote on her removal from the board, the result was unanimous, except for her own vote. But losing her position on the HOA board was just the beginning of Patricia's troubles. The criminal charges moved forward despite her attempts to plea bargain. The district attorney's office seemed particularly interested in the fraud aspects of the case. "This isn't just about trees," prosecutor Amanda Liu told the local newspaper. "This is about someone who abused their position of authority, committed fraud, and then attempted to cover it up. We take these cases seriously." Justice served Patricia's professional life began to crumble as well. She worked as a real estate agent for a prestigious firm, and news of her environmental violations spread quickly through the local real estate community. Several high-profile clients dropped her, not wanting to be associated with someone who had a criminal record for destroying protected wildlife habitat. "How can I trust someone to help me buy a home when she can't even follow basic environmental laws?" said one former client who spoke anonymously to the newspaper. Her broker, sensing the potential damage to the firm's reputation, suggested she take a voluntary leave of absence while the legal matters were resolved. Patricia had no choice but to agree. "The day of her court appearance, I made sure to attend. I wanted to see justice served, to witness the consequences of her actions." The courthouse was busier than usual, with several neighbors and local reporters present. Patricia stood before Judge Michael Harrison in a conservative navy suit, her usual confident demeanor completely gone. She looked small and vulnerable, nothing like the imperious HOA president who had terrorized our neighborhood. Prosecutor Liu laid out the case methodically. She described the unauthorized destruction of protected habitat, the false claims of HOA authority, Patricia's attempt to cover up her actions, and the significant environmental impact of her decisions. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, "the defendant showed a blatant disregard for environmental law and abused her perceived authority. Her actions displaced multiple protected species and destroyed years of habitat development. This wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding, this was deliberate destruction followed by attempted fraud." Judge Harrison's expression grew increasingly stern as he reviewed the evidence. Photos of the destroyed trees, the security footage, documentation of the displaced wildlife, and Patricia's own signed contract with the tree service company painted a clear picture of deliberate wrongdoing. Patricia's new lawyer, a public defender since she could no longer afford private counsel, attempted to argue for leniency. "Your Honor, my client is a first-time offender. She made a mistake in judgment, but she's already suffered significant consequences. She's lost her position on the HOA board, her reputation in the community, and her livelihood." Judge Harrison listened patiently, then addressed Patricia directly. "Ms. Hawthorne, you've shown a blatant disregard for environmental law and an abuse of perceived authority. Your actions displaced protected wildlife and destroyed years of habitat development that was specifically protected by state law." He continued, his voice growing more serious. "While this court recognizes that this is your first offense, the deliberate nature of your actions and your attempt to hide behind organizational authority you didn't actually possess shows a concerning lack of judgment and respect for the law." The gavel came down with a resounding crack. "I hereby sentence you to 90 days in county jail, suspended to 30 days, with 2 years probation. You are fined $25,000, payable to the State Wildlife Conservation Fund. Additionally, you must complete 200 hours of community service with local environmental organizations." Patricia's face went white. Her lawyer had told her to expect fines, but jail time, even suspended, clearly hadn't been on her radar. "Your Honor," she stammered, "I have job responsibilities, financial obligations." Judge Harrison cut her off. "You should have considered that before destroying protected habitat, Ms. Hawthorne. The 30 days will be served on weekends to allow you to maintain employment, if you still have any." As the bailiff read out the additional terms, monthly check-ins with a probation officer, mandatory environmental education classes, and a 10-year ban on serving on any HOA board, Patricia slumped in her chair. The weight of her actions was finally sinking in. Restoration and reflection. The aftermath of Patricia's sentencing brought unexpected changes to our neighborhood. The new HOA board, led by Eleanor, who came out of retirement to serve as interim president, immediately began working with environmental restoration experts to repair the damage. The restoration process was extensive and expensive. The HOA was required to plant native trees that would support local wildlife, following a strict plan approved by the Department of Fish and Wildlife. The cost, nearly $30,000, was covered by a special assessment on all homeowners, though Patricia was required to pay the largest share as part of her restitution. But the new trees weren't the only changes. The board also revised the HOA bylaws to include environmental protections and established a proper appeals process for any future landscaping decisions. They created a neighborhood wildlife committee, with Eleanor as the chair, to monitor and protect the local ecosystem. Patricia served her 30 days in county jail on weekends, arriving Friday evening and leaving Monday morning. I would occasionally see her during these trips, always looking smaller and more defeated than the last time. Her community service consisted of trail maintenance and habitat restoration in local parks, fitting, considering her crime. 6 months after her sentencing, I was working in my garden when I noticed something remarkable. The new trees were small, just saplings really, but they were already attracting wildlife. A pair of house finches had built a nest in the protective caging around one of the young apple trees. Squirrels had discovered the bird feeder I had installed, and they were already establishing new routes across the yard. It would be years before the new trees could replace what had been lost, but life was finding a way to return to my backyard. The restoration wasn't just about replacing trees, it was about healing the entire ecosystem that Patricia had destroyed. Eleanor stopped by one evening as I was watering the new plantings. "You know," she said, "what Patricia did was terrible, but look what it led to. Our whole neighborhood is more aware of environmental issues now. We have protections in place that never existed before." She was right. The destruction of my trees had awakened something in our community. People were more engaged, more aware of the wildlife around them. Children were learning about local ecosystems in school. The neighborhood had become a model for urban wildlife conservation. But for me, the most meaningful change was personal. As I tended to the new trees, I felt my mother's presence again. Not in the same way as before, these weren't the trees we had planted together, but in the act of nurturing, of creating something beautiful and beneficial for the future. The roots of justice. 2 years later, Patricia completed her probation and community service. She had moved to a different city, unable to rebuild her reputation in our community. The real estate career she had worked decades to build was over, destroyed by her own petty vindictiveness. The new trees in my yard were growing strong, already several feet tall and beginning to develop the character that would make them, in time, magnificent specimens. The apple tree had produced its first small crop of fruit, and I made sure to share the apples with the birds and squirrels that had returned to claim their territory. The neighborhood had transformed as well. What had started as one woman's abuse of power had become a catalyst for positive change. We had learned the value of speaking up against injustice, of protecting the vulnerable, whether they were people or wildlife. Sometimes I think about Patricia and wonder if she learned anything from her experience. Did she understand that her actions had consequences beyond herself? Did she realize that her need for control had ultimately destroyed everything she thought she was protecting? Justice, I learned, isn't just about punishment, it's about restoration. It's about making things right, not just for the immediate victims, but for the entire community. The roots of justice run deep, just like the trees that now grow in my backyard, reaching toward the light and providing shelter for all who need it. As I write this, sitting in my backyard on a warm summer evening, I can hear the songs of birds in the growing branches above me. The sound is different from before, these are younger voices, new life finding its place in an old ecosystem. But there's continuity too, a sense that the circle of life has been restored, that justice has taken root and is growing strong. The trees Patricia destroyed were irreplaceable, but they were not the end of the story. From their destruction came renewal, from injustice came justice, and from one woman's petty tyranny came a community's awakening to the beauty and importance of the natural world around us. In the end, that may be the most fitting memorial to my mother's memory and the most complete victory over Patricia's destructive impulses. The trees she cut down had been about the past, my connection to my mother, my memories of what was. The new trees are about the future, what we can build together, what we can protect, and what we can pass on to the next generation. Justice, like the trees in my yard, grows slowly but surely, its roots spreading deep into the earth, its branches reaching toward the sky, providing shelter and sustenance for all who need it. And that, perhaps, is the most beautiful thing of all.